to introduce the second speaker for our session today, Emeritus Professor Gary Hawke. Now, as you'll be aware, to become an Emeritus Professor you need to have retired, isn't that right, Gary?
Yeah. Simply means a professor without worth.
So my understanding is that after a distinguished career at Victoria University for something like 40 years, Gary retired as head of the School of Government and Professor of Economic History in 2008. Now I've got about, I could speak for 20 minutes probably just on his CV alone, so I'll pick out a couple of highlights. Visiting fellow at Stanford, All Souls College at Oxford, the Australian National University and a number of institutions in Japan. Tawny, lecturer for the Economic History Society in the UK in 1978 and New Zealand awarded the NZAR Qantas Prize for Economics, a fellow of the Royal Society, and many, many other accolades. Director of the Institute of Policy Studies from 87 to 1998 and a long record of advising government. Chaired the Cabinet Social Equity Committee Working Group on Compulsory Education and Training in 1988, still a review of applied social science capacity in 1995, and a member of the Superannuation 2000 Task Force. And if Judith Davey was here as well, she'd make me say that she was associated with the New Zealand Planning Council and chaired that. And I've also got to tell you, and I have this from good authority, that Gary's interested in modern art, is a devoted armchair critic of almost anything and a great cricket fan.
Thank you very much. My response to the invitation here was to say that I could rely on Margaret to give a solid background on the origins of the welfare system, that I would simply ask a few provocative questions, to which she added quite correctly that she was going to ask some provocative questions herself, and so I'm simply going to add to a few of those provocative questions. I really would like to start with where we all started from, in a somewhat different sense from Margaret's. And this is a quotation from Tawny, written in the 1920s, but capturing a sense which I think was very commonly held in New Zealand in the late 19th century and into the 20th century, and capturing the sort of milieu in which the New Zealand welfare state was conceived in the first part of the 20th century. It's possible to conceive a community in which the necessary diversity of economic functions existed side by side with a large measure of economic and social equality, and in which, therefore, while the occupations and incomes of individuals varied, they lived nevertheless in much the same environment, enjoyed similar standards of health and education, found different positions according to their varying abilities, equally accessible to them, intermarried freely with each other, were equally immune from the more degrading forms of poverty, and equally secure against economic oppression. Notice the emphasis on the sort of social notions of what kind of equality, what kind of security people are aiming at. Notice also, and this was somewhat unusual for much of the period of the 20th century, the emphasis on diversity within a secure system with a degree of security around about them. Tawny, of course, was a very prominent English economic historian. He was also a social thinker of considerable stature in the first part of the 20th century, and he was also a Christian socialist. He was an Anglican socialist. And that, I think, is equally true of Walter Nash. A great deal of Walter Nash is best understood from looking at his Anglican background. As early as 1922, about the same time as he became the Secretary of the New Zealand Labour Party, he was writing about a first charge on all wealth created shall be the care of the aged, the ailing, the young. I have a very distinct recollection of Walter Nash saying much the same sorts of things in the 1950s and 1960s. But I had always remembered what he said as the first charge on the wealth of the nation should be the aged, the sick and the poor. And he said it so often, and he said it with slight variations from time to time. But I'm absolutely sure that he said the first charge on the wealth of a nation should be the aged, the sick and the poor, but I can't document it. I rather hope that Margaret might be able to give me those exact words from some source when Nash was saying it. Nash himself came to believe the first charge was a piece of socialist doctrine. Keith Sinclair went into considerable trouble to discover the origins of it when he was writing the biography of Nash, and it can in fact be traced to various Anglican documents in the first few years of the 20th century. It can't be traced to anything that looks remotely like a socialist origin. But that was what Nash actually thought about it. First charge, a prime claim on the wealth of a nation, and then various categories of people who were in some sort of need. The aged, Walter Nash was always old. The sick and the young, I don't think he could remember the young, but he certainly remembered the poor, which is what I remember with much more emphasis, and the sick in various forms. And that sort of sense, that Tawney-esque idea of what we're trying to do, mediated to New Zealand primarily through Nash, who had the responsibility for designing the really important extension of the welfare state in the 1930s. That's where we came from. And what's changed? Firstly, only since around the time of the Second World War has there been a ready availability of income statistics. It's only then that you'll be able to look down and say what proportion of income actually goes to the top decile, what proportion goes to the bottom decile. Only from the years after the Second World War did we come to think of equality in terms of income distribution in a sense of quantitative distributions of incomes. Many people will remember the book by Leslie Lipson on the politics of equality. It's frequently referred to. It's much less frequently read, because if people read it, they would discover that the idea of equality that Lipson had in mind, and his famous image was the Americans had got the Statue of Liberty, and if there were a New Zealand equivalent, it would be a statue to equality erected at the heads of Wellington Harbour. But the idea of equality that he had in mind was Tawney's idea. Social equality, equality of respect, equality of dignity. It was not equality of quantitative incomes. And there's been a quite marked change away from the traditional New Zealand ideas of what we're trying to do with a welfare state to a much more imported European idea of some sort of equality. Equality of opportunity or equality of outcome, but with incomes taking a much more prominent role. Nothing sinister about it. It is simply that statistics became much more readily available. After all, it was not easy to look at aggregate GDP even until around the time of the Second World War. The second important change was the ageing society and increased life expectancy. I find over time I've become much more sympathetic to the claims of aged people in society, but it is, I think, even though now frequently referred to, much discussed by the Retirement Commissioner, a grossly underestimated effect of what is driving social change. It is the most single important means by which our welfare structures are in fact coming under strain.